Money isn't just currency. It's the story of power. Welcome to We Listen. There's a pattern in American history that people rarely talk about. A pattern that explains why wars keep happening. Who pays the cost? And who quietly becomes richer every time bullets start flying. 5 American wars, 5 families. 5 empires built not on speculation, but on guaranteed profits, stamped, signed, and funded straight from the U.S. Treasury. There exists a business model in America that's more profitable than oil, more consistent than banking, and more protected than any monopoly ever created. A machine that has turned conflict into cash for more than a century. A machine that doesn't just survive war, it requires war. While millions died and taxpayers paid the bill, the same dynasties kept getting richer. The DuPonts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Lockheed Aviation Empire, and the Halliburton Brown and Root machine. 5 empires that learned a simple truth. When the nation bleeds, they profit. When soldiers go to war, their stock prices rise. When the public panics, they send invoices. And when peace arrives, they keep every dollar. This documentary is not conspiracy. This is capitalism applied to conflict, and the receipts are public record. In this video, we begin with the family that turned explosives into a dynasty, engineered America's early war machine, and laid the foundations of the military. Industrial complex 2 centuries before Eisenhower ever warned us about it. The DuPont family. Let's go back to the moment the fuse was lit. The gunpowder dynasty. How DuPont became America's war engine when a Luther, Irene DuPont, arrived in America in 1800. He was not a millionaire, not a power broker, not a titan of industry. He was a trained chemist from France who understood one thing better than almost anyone alive: gunpowder. And in the America of the early 1800s, gunpowder was not just a product, it was opportunity. The United States was expanding westward. Land needed clearing. Mines needed blasting. Armies needed ammunition. In 1802, DuPont set up a gunpowder mill on the Brandywine River in Delaware, a location carefully chosen like a chess move, close enough to Washington and Philadelphia to supply the government, far enough away that any accidental explosions wouldn't annoy politicians, and powered by the roaring river that turned millstones day and night. This company, this tiny riverside mill, would become the backbone of a fortune stretching across 6 generations. By the War of 1812, DuPont secured its first major military contract. Gunpowder was scarce, the government was desperate, and DuPont was the only company prepared with enough supply. Just like that, the fuse was lit. War starts, gives government panics, gives DuPont steps in, gives profits explode. That cycle repeats for 200 years. The Mexican-American War. The first real payday when the Mexican-American War erupted in 1846, DuPont wasn't the small mill anymore. It was the preferred supplier, and that status alone was worth millions. They supplied explosives for artillery, muskets, and naval operations. The contract was only about $1 million at the time, nearly $35 million today, but the real value wasn't the money. It was reputation. When you deliver during war, you don't just get paid. You become the default choice for the next war, and the next war was a monster. The Civil War, DuPont's financial breakthrough. The Civil War was the moment the DuPont dynasty truly detonated. 4 years, hundreds of battles, millions of rounds fired, explosives required on a scale never seen before in American history. DuPont's mills ran 24 hours a day. The smell of sulfur never left the Brandywine River. Over 4 million pounds of gunpowder rolled out of their factories. Contracts worth $10 million at the time, equivalent to over $300 million today. But here's the detail that cracks open the psychology of war profiteering. The DuPont family's political views did not match the Union. They were Northern Democrats who opposed abolition. Some members sympathized with the Confederacy, but they still sold to the Union because that's where the contracts were docked in war. Ideology bends. Profits do not. And when the North won, DuPont was celebrated as a patriotic company that helped save the nation. The political contradictions were swept aside. The money stayed. World War I, the explosion of a dynasty, nothing in American history, prepared the world for what happened next. World War I turned DuPont from a wealthy company into a global financial superpower. Before the U.S. even joined the war, DuPont supplied Britain and France gunpowder, smokeless, powder. TNT. Explosives of every kind. When America entered the war in 1917, DuPont scaled up at an industrial pace that bordered on frightening. They built entire new plants, hired tens of thousands of workers, and supplied 40% of all explosives used by the Allied forces. Their profits went from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918, a 1,600% increase, equivalent to over $1 billion in today's money. In 4 years, war transformed a company into a dynasty. And the DuPonts did something extraordinary, something that separates war profiteers from ordinary companies. They took the war money and built a peacetime empire. Chemicals, plastics, synthetic fibers, agricultural products, and eventually Teflon, the chemical that would coat everything from pans to spacecraft. But explosives never left the portfolio, not fully. World War II, from gunpowder to atoms. The Second World War brought another avalanche of government contracts. Explosives, parachute, nylon. Military polymers. And their most secretive project of all, DuPont operated the plutonium production plant at Hanford as part of the Manhattan Project. The contract was cost-plus. That meant DuPont could not lose money, no matter the cost overruns, no matter the delays. Government paid all expenses and added guaranteed profit. Risk was zero. Reward was unlimited. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Even after DuPont spun off parts of its defense division, the family wealth lived on. The DuPont family trust today is valued at over $30 billion. 6 generations removed from Luther DuPont, still living off the echoes of gunpowder from 1802. This is not history. This is a blueprint. Positioned before the war, delivered during the war. Diversify after the war. Repeat for 2 centuries. Now if the DuPonts built the explosives for American wars, another family built the fuel that made those wars possible. We'll continue this pattern with the Rockefellers, the Morgans, Lockheed's aviation empire, and the Halliburton machine that turned logistics into profit. Each one using a different strategy, each one proving the same truth. When nations go to war, a tiny group of families never lose. The DuPonts built America's explosives. They supplied the gunpowder that carved frontier paths, toppled armies, and powered 2 centuries of conflict. But explosives alone can't win a war. Armies need fuel, oceans of it, to move, to invade, to dominate. And fuel belonged to one dynasty. The Rockefellers. If the DuPonts lit the fuse, the Rockefellers fed the fire. This is the war machine's second pillar. Control the resource every modern military consumes more than bullets: oil. The Rockefellers' oil, war, and the age of petroleum power. John D. Rockefeller never fired a gun in a war. He didn't need to. His empire supplied the one thing no army could survive without. The story begins in 1870, when Rockefeller founded Standard Oil, a company so large, so relentless, and so efficient that within 10 years, it controlled 90% of America's refining capacity. By 1880, his monopoly was so powerful that American warfare itself bent around his product. The U.S. Navy was transitioning from coal to oil. Warships no longer ran on black dust shoveled by sweating sailors. They ran on refined petroleum, Rockefeller's petroleum. When the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, it was short, brutal, and strategically small. But it carried one message: the military that controlled oil, controlled victory. Standard Oil supplied the fleet. And Rockefeller learned that controlling fuel meant controlling governments. This was the beginning. But the real transformation came with World War I. World War I, the first oil war. World War I was the first truly industrial conflict. Tanks. Trucks. Aircraft. All mechanized. All thirsty for oil. Although the U.S. government broke up Standard Oil in 1911, the pieces remained Rockefeller pieces. Exxon. Mobil. Chevron. Their boards, their financing, their leadership, all deeply tied to the family. These companies supplied the U.S. military and the Allies. But here's where the story twists into the uncomfortable truth people tend to skip. Standard Oil's German subsidiary supplied Germany as well. Fuel. Lubricants. Chemicals. Even after the war began. Was it illegal? No, because technically these were independent companies in different nations. Was it moral? War doesn't ask about morality. It asks who profits. Rockefeller companies sold to both sides. Both sides burned that oil in tanks and planes. Both sides fought longer because supply lines stayed alive. And with every shipment, the Rockefeller fortune grew. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire in 1916, at the height of the war. Not by accident, but by design. Because if you control the fuel, the war never stops without your permission. World War II, patents, profits, and treason in the shadows. The Second World War revealed something darker. Rockefeller's successor companies again supplied the U.S. military, billions in contracts. Guaranteed profits. Cost plus pricing. Every gallon of fuel sold to the Navy and Army Air Forces printed money. But behind the scenes, another story stirred. Standard Oil of New Jersey, the future Exxon, shared patents with IG Farben, Nazi Germany's industrial giant. Synthetic rubber, fuel additives, chemical technology essential for the German war machine. Even after the war had begun, Senator Harry Truman investigated the connection. His committee found that these patent-sharing agreements had damaged the American war effort. But nothing happened. Why? Because the U.S. military needed petroleum. It needed Standard Oil. It needed Rockefeller's empire. You cannot prosecute the people who supply the blood of your war machine. So the story was buried. The contracts continued. And the dynasty weathered every storm. When World War II ended, Rockefeller companies didn't move away from war. They pivoted. Korea, Vietnam. The Cold War, the Gulf War. Afghanistan, Iraq. Every conflict required oil. And ExxonMobil, Chevron, and the Rockefeller successor network kept supplying it. Today, the Rockefeller fortune is estimated at $11 billion, diversified across banking, real estate, philanthropy, and investment funds. But the foundation, the bedrock, is war-fueled oil. Because armies can march without hope, but not without fuel. The Morgan dynasty, the bankers who financed war and peace. If war needs explosives and fuel, it needs something even more important. Money. The third dynasty didn't sell weapons or oil. They sold credit, and credit wins. WARS. J.P. Morgan wasn't a general. He never commanded troops. But in terms of power, he built something far greater. A financial empire that could decide which nations lived and which nations fell. The Spanish-American War, the first test. Morgan's early dealings with the U.S. government created a relationship built on trust, influence, and enormous leverage. During the Spanish-American War, Morgan loans helped finance the U.S. effort. It wasn't a massive war, but it set the precedent. When America needed money fast, Morgan delivered. And the government paid in interest, in fees, in long-term dependence. World War I. The bank that made America enter the war. The moment war erupted in Europe in 1914, America declared neutrality. But neutrality didn't mean inaction. J.P. Morgan and Co. immediately extended credit to Britain and France. Not millions. Billions. More than $2 billion between 1914 and 1917. Over $50 billion today. Here's the key. Those loans were used to buy weapons, food, supplies from American companies. So Morgan lent money to the Allies, who spent that money with American factories, whose profits went back into American banks, including Morgan. It was a closed-loop system, but it had a side effect, a dangerous one. By 1917, Britain and France were so deeply in debt to American banks that if they lost the war, they could never repay. And if they couldn't repay, American banks would collapse. So when Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war, the choice wasn't just moral or political. It was financial. Senator George Norris said it openly. We are going into war upon the command of gold. A war to protect American loans, billions of them. And when America entered the war, J.P. Morgan didn't just win. They became untouchable. The aftermath profits from the ruins after the war. Germany owed reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France owed repayments to America. Morgan bankers created the Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929. Financial architectures that refinanced billions in European debt. Germany borrowed from Morgan, gives paid allies. Gives allies paid America. Gives Morgan collected fees at every stage. The bank that financed the war financed the peace and financed the consequences. A perfect cycle. A profitable cycle. World War II and the age of global finance. Before America entered World War II, Morgan banks again financed British war purchases. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government borrowed heavily through treasury bonds. Morgan underwrote them, collected fees. And secured another generation of financial dominance. When the war ended, Morgan played a large role in administering Reconstruction through the Marshall Plan and European financial institutions. War. Recovery. Cold War Rearmament.Vietnam.Nuclear. Buildup.Iraq.Afghanistan. Every era generated enormous government borrowing. And Morgan, later J.P. Morgan Chase, stayed at the center. The Morgan family no longer runs the bank, but the fortune remains, built on a century of financing war, explosives, fuel.money. 3 pillars. 3 dynasties. Now we reach the final 2 pillars of the war machine. The companies that built the weapons, the planes, the bases, the supply chains. The empires that turned modern warfare into a billion-dollar routine. Lockheed. And Halliburton.